just going back to the start to make sure that we are happy. We should be clear on why the poor laws were amended. We should be clear on a range of problems with the old system. We should understand the features of the new poor law, and we should understand some of the effects. That was our table at the end there. And we should understand some of the principles behind it. So utilitarianism, the principle of less eligibility, and understanding the context of changes to the poor law. If you really wanted to, you could add 1834 onto that timeline that you started with. And again, colour code the deserving poor and the able-bodied poor. Okay, so thus endeth lesson 2. I hope you found it useful. And thank you for the positive feedback on these lessons. It seems like for some of you they're helpful, which is great to hear. And yeah, watch out for future posts because I will keep updating. Okay, take care, guys. Bye. Okay, so a brief history of the poor laws, just setting ourselves into context here. If you have a look on page 142 of the photocopied chapter that I've mentioned, you'll see, as it says there, read page 142 and just draw yourself a brief timeline to show the 4 developments in the poor law that are listed on page 142. It helps you to kind of set everything in context. So I would take a whole A4 page for this. You can do it either horizontally or vertically, it doesn't really matter. And as you can see there, it kind of all starts off in 1601 with the Elizabethan Poor Law. And I'm sure you'll remember back to looking at that when we did early Elizabethan England for our GCSE. And you might, probably the bit that kind of occurs to you is the vagabonds and the beggars. So we know that the Elizabethans had a bit of a suspicion of anybody that appeared to be able-bodied and was begging for money. Notwithstanding that, they did, however, make it the parish's job to provide a poor rate to help the deserving poor. And they were to find work, towns had to find work for people who were unemployed. But you'll see a kind of list of key things there on page 142. And it goes through 1662, 1723 and up to 1782, which is when unions first appear. That's a really key bit of language, unions. So it's worth making sure you've got a little definition there on the left-hand side in the box. It's a group of parishioners, people from a parish, who join together to build a workhouse. So 1782 is when that concept first comes up. So if you draw out your timeline, add on your 4 dates and what was done on each date. And as I put here, another helpful thing to do will be to colour code your timeline to show the developments that affected the deserving poor, so anybody too old, too sick, disabled to work, or those who were orphaned. And second colour, the able-bodied. So what was done at each time for the able-bodied poor, those who were able to work but either couldn't find work or some attitudes suggested they chose not to. There tends to be a distinction in how they are treated. So pause the PowerPoint there and just make sure that you've done your timeline and you've colour coded it as instructed. Okay, so hopefully you've finished your timeline now. And final thing that I would like you to do before we turn over any further, page 143 under the subheading Outdoor Relief just provides a brief further explanation of the Speen-Hamland system, and that was one of the key terms that I asked you to write in your glossary last lesson. So have a little read of that paragraph. It's fairly self-explanatory. There's also quite a helpful little table, 9C, of statistics, which just, I think, helped for those of you that are of a, kind of like their numbers and figures, you can see how it worked. Go back to your glossary from last lesson and just add any clarification that you can to your definition of the Speen-Hamland system. Okay, so again, just briefly pause, turn back to the glossary, have a little read of page 143, and then we're ready to go on and look at some sources together. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance now to answer those 3 questions. Just a summary for you, really, where, like to make your life easy where possible. So what was wrong with the old poor laws? This is at the bottom there. It might be an idea to turn this into a mind map. So again, you've got it in your notes. So for 4 subheadings. Number 1, too much variation. We got that from the sources, the map sources that we've just looked at. Each parish, and there were over 15,000 parishes. That's a good statistic to know. So make sure you've got that in your notes. So each parish was responsible for their own poor. Central government did not deal with poor relief. So it just depended on where you lived, what you got, and how it was organised. In order to pay for it, as we already know, because we looked at this last lesson, parishes would charge a poor rate. And in order to receive help, you had to go back to the parish you were born in. And that comes through, if you think back to the timeline you did at the start of the lesson, that came through in the 1662 change to the Poor Law, where they talked about the settlement of labourers. So if you were born into a rural area, found yourself out of work due to enclosure, changes in farming, you move to a town, and then you're temporarily laid off from the factory because they don't get the raw materials in that month that they needed, you are not entitled to anything unless you traipse all the way back to your original parish to claim poor relief there. Now, this is the era of the Industrial Revolution. Social mobility, people are on the move, work practices are changing. There's rapid movement from rural areas to urban areas. So clearly, this is going to cause problems, this system. So you have to go to your original parish to seek relief, and the relief you got depended on what your parish happened to be giving out. Second problem, wages were kept low. We're back to that Speen-Hamland system, aren't we, which is indicative of the fact that it was acceptable to pay starvation wages, very, very low wages. So wages were kept low, employers had no incentive to raise them. This all, you probably read on page 143 about the roundsman system as well, which was where people kind of traipsed around looking for temporary work. They were paid a pittance, and again, it was the expectation that the local parish would add to their wages to give them a kind of living wage. So again, keeping wages low. So that was also a problem with the old system. Social changes, well, I've already explained this, I'm sorry, but there we go. People had moved from rural areas to the cities for work. They couldn't just walk all the way back to their original parish for poor relief, particularly if they've now got a large family, as many people in the industrial cities did. So the system seemed to reward the undeserving poor. In other words, those who just stayed put, they didn't actually have the wherewithal to get up, go out and search for work. And final problem, thinking back to those sources that we looked at for cost, population growth and high food prices had raised the cost of poor relief. So up from 4 million at the start of the century to a high of 7 million or even over 7 million by 1818 and 1830. So the authorities can't continue to just keep increasing the amount they pay out to the poor. They need to find a solution. So pause the PowerPoint there and make sure that you've drawn up for yourself a mind map or a list if you prefer with those 4 headings, adding in some of the detail about what was wrong, and feel free to supplement that with information from the sources, or you might even want to look at your textbook, the orange one. Okay, so hopefully you've now finished your mind map. So next little job for you guys, I'm keeping you busy today. We've done a timeline, we've done some questions, we've done a mind map. So the next little job is to draw a table with 3 columns. And I want you to just think now about the impact the problems had, and then the impact of the new poor law at the end of the lesson on 5 different groups. So draw a table with 3 columns, list those 5 groups in the left-hand column. Make sure you leave plenty of space between each one. So you might want to take a whole A4 page for this. And then in the middle column, you explain briefly what each of these groups would want from the poor laws. So I would suggest you pause the PowerPoint here, draw out your table, plot in your 5 different groups, and then for each of those groups, what do you think, from what you've learned so far, would be their main aim with regard to a new poor law? What would they want to achieve if the poor law was being amended? Okay, so back again. Hopefully you've done your table, had a little think about each group. There's no right and wrong for this. We're just trying to get you thinking about the issue of poverty and the fact that different groups, of course, would want different things. So it's not easy to solve it. So thinking about that top group, the middle class, who were the ones that were being expected to pay the poor rates within each parish, rather than the upper class who've done it for a long time. So for a lot of the middle class who aren't super rich, presumably they would want to reduce the amount they have to pay. So they want a cost reduction, don't they? They want a limitation or a control on the cost of poor relief. Supporters of laissez-faire, they don't believe the government should be interfering either with the way people live or the way the economy functions. So laissez-faire supporters might want removal of relief unless it's really for the absolute most needy. Social reformers like Chadwick and Bentham. So we've met Bentham before when we looked at radicalism. He's popped up. So if you want a little reminder about Bentham, there's a summary of him in your photocopied chapter on page 147. Down the bottom there, there's a box on the left-hand side called Benthamism, Utilitarianism. Put simply, Bentham's idea was that you should try and achieve the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people, and that was the job of social reform. So you should investigate the problem, you should kind of use a scientific approach, investigate the problem, come up with a range of solutions, and then try out those solutions and see which worked. So Bentham would have favoured a system of poor relief that tried to help the greatest number of people. However, people does not necessarily include the masses. Often people was a definition that included the voters. Sorry, lost my head there for a second. Can't believe I'm getting bored. It's so interesting. Edwin Chadwick, might not have met him before. Some of you know me well will know that I have a son named after him. So Edwin Chadwick was a social reformer who looked into the problem of poverty in the 1830s and in particular was interested in conditions in towns and how the poor lived in towns, and again believed that it was the work of the government should be to alleviate poverty in towns and cities across the country. So what would they have wanted from the new poor law? Some kind of national system. The rural poor. So in farming areas, it tended to be seasonal unemployment that was an issue for them. So they probably would have wanted some kind of system where when the farming year was quiet, they could claim poor relief. They usually lived in their local parish already. So outdoor relief, so handouts where they could remain in their own homes would probably have worked quite well for them. The urban poor, the cycle of unemployment was a little bit different in the towns. It wasn't seasonal. It wasn't kind of every late summer you were out of work. It depended obviously upon the economy. So it depended upon the flow of raw materials in and the sale of goods out. So for the urban poor, unemployment tended to be in short bursts. So again, they probably wanted some kind of poor relief that would just tide the family over until they could get back into the factory again and resume their shifts. So again, some kind of short-term help would have been preferable for them. Okay, keep your tables handy because we will return to them at the end of the lesson. Okay, so let's have a look then at what actually happened. How did the Whig government in 1834 change the poor laws? And again, we're going to look at the sources and see if we can kind of work it out from a range of sources. So if you turn to page 148, you'll see there are a number of sources and they are all taken from the reports from His Majesty's Commissioners for inquiring into the poor laws. So essentially Chadwick and a group of other civil servants investigated poverty and came up with a range of proposals about what would help to solve the problem. So what I'd like you to do is have a read of each of those sources, and next to each source is a little activity box which has a comprehension question just to check that you've understood what the source is talking about. So pause the PowerPoint, have a look at those sources. So they run from page 148 to page 149. See if you can answer the question next to each source. And when you've done that, kind of, putting it all together, what do you think the new rules would have been? Can you just summarise, without committing yourself, what do you think the government was going to do about poverty in 1834? Okay, so good luck with that, and I'll speak to you about it in a minute. Okay, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through the sources, gain an understanding. You only need to get the gist. You don't need to understand every single word, but the more we practice looking at the language of the 1830s, the better we get at it. And then we'll see what you think about what the eventual proposals might have been. So source 9.17 essentially says that taking poor relief away makes labourers more diligent or more efficient. In other words, they work harder. The factory owner makes a bigger profit, and then from that profit will pay higher wages, so everybody benefits. So take the poor relief away and the workers work much harder because they know they need to keep their job, essentially, is what the source is suggesting. The next one, source 9.18, talks about keeping the condition of the pauper. So pauper is a word for a poor person, inferior to that of an independent labourer, in other words, a worker. So essentially what they're saying is what we've experimented here and what we've realised is that when labourers kind of do better than people who are in poverty, they tend to behave themselves more. So the two consequences of depauperisation, in other words, getting rid of poor people, are the number of improvident marriages is diminished. Improvident, unsuitable, in other words. So they're not marrying unsuitable people. The number of illegitimate births has gone down, and born out of wedlock, for those of you who didn't know the word illegitimate. And finally, a reduction in crime. So by dealing with paupers harshly, you're bringing about kind of social improvements. Source 9.19, offer work instead of allowances. So, and you've got there a list, industry. So in other words, their approach to work has been restored and improved. Frugal habits. So if you're frugal, you don't waste anything. The permanent demand for labour has increased. So there's more jobs. Wages has increased. So essentially, don't offer poor people a handout, offer them a job. Source 9.2 is an extract from His Majesty's Commissioners. Again, they all are. And essentially, they're saying, get rid of outdoor relief. So outdoor relief is a handout. It could be food, it could be essential items, a pair of shoes, for example, it could be money. And essentially what they're saying is that needs to go. And instead, if they're really, really desperate, people will be offered a place in a workhouse. Source 9.2 says there needs to be central supervision. So it talks about recommending a central board to control the administration of the poor laws. To administer something is to oversee how it's carried out. So in other words, rather than each parish doing it, this would be something that was set by central government in London, and every single area would have the same system. And finally, source point 922 talks about apprenticing children, and it gives you the definition of that in the box. So child paupers would be given out to local businessmen to use as labour, train them up, give them a skill. So it's a good idea. They should have been paid a small wage, but as it says there, in actual fact, they were often little more than slaves. So what do you think the main rules of the Poor Law Amendment Act were, looking at those sources? Well, hopefully you've got some idea that actually the central government was going to take over responsibility for the poor. It wasn't going to be down to individual parishes anymore. There seems to be a sense that handouts, giving out outdoor relief was wrong and that it was having a detrimental effect. So hopefully you'd kind of sussed out that that's going to go. There's going to be no more relief given to people in their own homes. And instead there's going to be offers of work, and they've also alluded to the idea of the workhouse. So next slide just kind of summarises. Oh, I'll skip question 3 and move on to the next slide. There we go. So the next slide just summarises briefly what the new Poor Law Amendment Act said. And again, it's worth having this in your notes. So it's worth either copying or summarising. So outdoor relief, that's the handouts, continued, but only for the old and infirm. Infirm means ill or disabled, people unable to work. Outdoor relief was abolished, so got rid of if you were able-bodied. They would not give you a handout of any kind. Conditions in the workhouse. So they're going to use workhouses for the able-bodied poor. More on them later. But conditions inside should be less eligible, in other words, worse than for the lowest paid labourer. because it didn't seem fair that you would get better treatment in a workhouse than somebody who was actually working for money. So conditions in the workhouse were, in other words, deliberately to be off-putting. And we call that the principle of less eligibility. A Poor Law Commission was established, so their job was to, they were like an old-fashioned version of Ofsted. They were to go around and inspect all the different areas across the country to make sure that the poor law was being operated in a homogenous fashion, the same way all over the country. Parishes, these tiny little parishes, 15,500 of them in total, were to join together to build a workhouse. So they would form poor law unions, because it was impractical to suggest that every single parish would build their own workhouse. So the individual parishes were got rid of, and instead they joined together, and each group would provide one central workhouse, and that would be run by a board of guardians. And finally, the classes of pauper were to be kept separate inside the workhouse. So children were separated from adults, men were separated from women. And that meant that, in effect, if you went into a workhouse, you would no longer be able to live as a family. So there is a further summary for you to have a look at. So use that slide and use the scroll on page 150 and make sure you've got a summary of the poor law. And pause the show there to enable you to write that up and have that in your notes. Okay, so we're almost there. We're doing really well. This is a big old chunky lesson, lots and lots of learning in it, but it's great because this is where you're getting the real nitty gritty about the problem of poverty and what the government tried to do to solve it. So going back to that table that you partly filled in, you should now be able to do the final column. So in the right-hand column, which should still be blank, again, looking at those 5 groups, you now know what happened in 1834. How far did each group get what they want? So did the ratepayers get to pay lower rates? Well, there was a curb on spending because the outdoor relief wasn't just being given out willy-nilly anymore. However, they did have the immediate cost of providing workhouses to contend with, although at least that was done by unions rather than individual parishes. Supporters of laissez-faire? Well, there had to be some provision for the poor. Social reformers like Chadwick and Bentham, I think they got quite a lot of what they wanted in terms of utilitarianism, rationalising everything, making it more efficient. The rural poor, well, outdoor relief for the able-bodied had gone, and that was going to be a problem if you were a farm labourer who suffered seasonal unemployment. The urban poor, outdoor relief had gone, so that was going to be a problem if you were a factory worker who sometimes got laid off because the factory didn't have the raw materials or the sales that week or that month to justify your wages. So the poor are going to lose out as a result. So again, you might want to just pause briefly, fill in the rest of your table, and then we're on to the final slide. We're almost there. So there is a clip that we'd like you to watch. I'll post the link onto Schoology for you, and it's from Oliver, which is a musical, but of course it's based on the 1837 novel written by Charles Dickens. So Dickens wrote Oliver Twist in 1837, 3 years after the main Poor Law. And as I've put there, just a note about the provenance. So the musical was released in 1968. It was a British production. It was award-winning at the time. However, of course, it was based on the original novel by Charles Dickens. And Dickens was a journalist and a novelist, but also a well-known social campaigner. And he challenged the upper class on their attitudes to the poor and social reform. So in Oliver Twist, the main character is born into the workhouse and gets into a life of crime. He's quite a gentle character and suffers a lot of cruelty at the hands of the authorities. So have a little look at the clip from Oliver. If you've got some spare time on your hands, you could try and watch the whole musical. There's plenty of later adaptations if you don't want to watch the 1868. If you don't want to watch the 1968 version, please feel free to watch a more modern version. But it's interesting in kind of helping us to understand that not everybody at the time was a supporter of the Poor Law Amendment Act. Okay.